So I tried to put together a show with the minimum number of slides to provide a basic introduction. Unfortunately, it's still kind of long. I'll have to move a little bit quickly through some of them to get done in time, and I will try to watch the time. But you can get a copy of the slides afterwards in case I go a little bit too fast for you. Let me start off with the way that everybody is introduced to money. Whether you studied economics or not, I'm sure you got this story. I can remember when my daughter was in first grade, and she came to me and told me this story. And I said, well, actually, that's not quite right. She said, yes, it is, Daddy. This is what the teacher said. So you get it from a very young age. It begins with barter. We've got Robinson Crusoe. He's shipwrecked. He meets Friday. Crusoe knows how to grow grain. Friday knows how to fish, so they barter. But this can be very inconvenient because it requires that on the day that Friday wants to deliver a fish, Crusoe actually wants a fish and he's willing to trade grain for it. So the story is that it requires a double coincidence of wants. So it's inconvenient. They search around for something to act as a medium of exchange. They might begin with seashells, but through some evolutionary process, they end up with gold, which has some nice characteristics that make it a very good medium of exchange. It's very valuable, it doesn't rot, and on and on and on. So this greatly reduces the transactions costs involved in barter. There is one problem with gold. It is extremely valuable. You got to worry about people who will try to take away your gold stock. So you start storing it with the goldsmiths. The goldsmiths already had that problem. They had to protect the gold stock that they're using to make jewelry. They have safes and so on, and so you would deposit your gold with the goldsmith. The goldsmith gives you a receipt. People discover that they actually can use those receipts in payments rather than using the gold, because individuals who accept them know that they can go get the gold out of the goldsmith's safe whenever they want. The goldsmith, in turn, realizes that he actually doesn't have to keep the gold in the safe. He only needs to keep a little bit because those receipts are not all going to come back on the same day. Okay, so he discovers what we now call the deposit expansion process. He can issue lots of receipts and hold just a little bit of gold, maybe 10%, for safekeeping to redeem on demand. Those goldsmiths become the banks. So that's the story. In the conventional approach, the money supply is exogenous. I'm getting into a little higher level of analysis now. This is what you would get in your money and banking textbook. That has a multiplier because you only have to keep 10% of reserves for withdrawals and for clearing with other banks on hand. So we get a money multiplier. The idea is that the central bank that issues the reserve can control the quantity of money that's created by controlling the quantity of reserves that they supply. So there was a belief for a very long time, really pushed by Milton Friedman and other monetarists, that central banks can and should control the rate of growth of money supply in order to control inflation. And so for a long time, the idea was we will target money supply. Really nobody who understands how banks and central banks operate believes that anymore. All the major central banks around the world have moved away from money targeting toward interest rate targeting, but the goal is still the same. The idea is that the central bank, because it is the issuer of reserves, can control the price of the reserves that it issues and thereby control the interest rates, and that allows it to continue to fight inflation even though it's recognized they can't control the money supply. Okay, what is money in this view? I want to say something about the nature of money, and I'm going to contrast it with the MMT view. Money comes about to lubricate the market. It's more efficient than barter. Specific money-denominated assets fulfill that function, medium of exchange, exactly which kinds of things fulfill that function, changes over time. For a very long time, it supposedly was gold, okay, but gradually we have changed those money things that fulfill that function. But still today, the focus is on money as a medium of exchange. There are other functions that money serves, but those derive from the medium of exchange function. So medium of exchange is the most important function of money. Continuing on in the textbooks, so in every macroeconomics textbook, within the first 2 or 3 chapters, you're going to get a picture like this one, the circular flow diagram. Okay, and this is focusing on the use of money as a medium of exchange in something like a real capitalist economy. The firms hire the factor services. They need to pay wages to households. The households use those wages to buy the output of the firms. So the money moves in a flow between households and firms in this very simple economy. If you think about it for a minute, and if you ever asked your teacher, where did the firms get the money that they use to pay the wages to the household? They say, oh, well, the firms use the money that they get when the households buy the consumer goods that the firms produce. Say, oh, okay, where did the households get the money? Well, they got it from the firms that paid their wages. You can see that this is a circular argument with an infinite regress. There is no story of how the money got into the economy, okay? You finally move on to somewhere around chapter 9, where you start studying money and banking in your macro textbook. And they put financial institutions into the circular flow. Now this one is more complicated because we also have the government, we have the foreign sector, and so on. But the point is that now we've got banks in the story. The banks lend to firms which use the loans to invest, okay? The payments go to the workers in the investment goods sector that are producing the investment goods. They can use that money to either save or to consume. Their savings in the banks gets lent out to the firms to finance their investment. So the banks are intermediaries between savers and investors. So you ask the question, where did the money come from? Well, the banks got it from the savers so that they can lend it to the firms. Where do the households get the money? Well, they got it from the firms who are spending on production of the investment goods. It's the same infinite regress, the same circular flow, okay? Circular argument. There is really no story of how the money got into the economy. Okay, what is wrong with this orthodox story? I know that I am being very quick explaining the dominant paradigm on money and banking. But what's wrong with it? First, there's actually no evidence of barter-based markets. And I don't know if any of you have read David Graeber's book. This was just a fantastic success, an unimaginable success. Debt the first 5,000 years. Everybody bought this book. Okay, it was a runaway bestseller. It's like 5,000 pages long. It's the kind of book everybody buys and probably hardly anybody reads, including me. I've got it on my shelf. Maybe when I retire, I'll finally get the time to read it. Okay, but what David shows is that when we look around the world, as far back as we go, you just do not find any economies anywhere based on barter. They just do not exist. Okay? And what we actually find when we look at history, and I knew this long before Graeber, is that money actually pre-exists markets. Money was not invented as a transactions cost minimizing device for markets that already existed. Money pre-exists markets. Okay, money is as old as writing. How do we know that? The very first written records are all about money. Okay, basically, Writing was not invented by poets. It was invented by accountants to keep track of money values. All right? So money exists before markets, so there's something wrong with that part of the story. And even the Austrians who pushed for a very long time this barter story, they now admit that once you get beyond about 10 people and 10 different commodities, it's very hard for market higgling and haggling to settle on a single commodity that will serve as money. If you're talking about many commodities and many people involved, unless you add modern computing power, you're not going to select a single commodity to serve as your money commodity. And finally, from the very beginning, the evidence shows that authorities were always involved in the monetary system, in creating the monies of account. I'll come back to that. So authorities were always there. It wasn't Robinson Crusoe and Friday that invented money. It came out of the authorities. Another problem with the story is modern money has no intrinsic value. This is a little bit hard to explain when your whole story was about choosing a commodity that was very valuable that could serve as your money commodity. Okay? Today's monies are not attached to any commodities. They have no intrinsic values. And neither did ancient money, in spite of the goldsmith story. As far back as you go, the money things did not have intrinsic values, usually. Okay. There's an infinite regress problem. What people will do then is they say, well, yes, in the past it was gold that gave money value, but today it is trust. They ask them, well, what is the trust in the money? They say, well, I trust that Billy Bob will take it from me in payment. I trust I can go to the grocery store and someone will take it. Okay? In my view, that's a very thin argument to base the most important institution we have in modern economies, which is money, on trust. And also, there is no circular flow that can explain where the money comes from. How does it get into the economy? So I'm going to present an alternative. This is sort of a summary of the topics that I'll cover. Origins and nature, the role of the state, the role of taxes, what sovereign currencies are all about, and what that has to do with fiscal policy. Okay, if you look at what archaeology has found and what anthropologists have found, we can start with this one. So this is 50,000 years old. This was some kind of humans. And if you can see it from your seat, they have put scratch marks in there. It's a rock. They put scratch marks in that. So archaeologists have dug this up and they can date it. Okay? What is it? We don't know. They're keeping track of something. We don't know what it is. Over here, sorry, this was 500,000 years. 50,000 years, those bones. Harder for you to see from the seat, but you can look at it later. Much more complicated scratch marks on it, keeping track of something 50,000 years ago. What are they keeping track of? We don't know. Okay, it's dug out of the ground. They didn't leave a written record because there was no writing. Clay balls, which are gradually transformed into the cuneiform tablets. What are those? Okay, 5,000 years. We know. We can read them. It's all about money and debts. It's keeping track of money and debts. Okay, we can read those things. What are these? Does anyone know? They're made of wood. They are tally sticks. Tally sticks. We still use the terms stock and stub. Tally sticks were hazelwood sticks that put the hash marks that look an awful lot like the bones. They're 50,000 years old. Okay. These were used in Europe until 1919. Tally sticks, hash marks in them, split into stock and stub. This is how most European kings spent. They spent tally sticks. They didn't spend coins. They spent tally sticks. The majority of their spending and the majority of their tax revenue was in the form of tally sticks. Why did you split them? To stop counterfeiters. When you paid your taxes, they had to literally match the stock and stub to make sure you didn't cut a few more hash marks. We still use the terms. What's a score? 4.7 years ago. Score, it's 20 pounds. It was a thick cut in the stick. That's a score. Raise a tally. All the Americans have heard that term. Raise a tally. Okay? It means go out and cut some tally sticks off the trees. That's how the king raised revenue. Okay? So, where did money come from? We do not know, and we will not know. Nobody sat down and wrote a memo, today I invented money and this is how I did it. We're not going to find that. Because money pre-existed writing. As I said, the first writing already is talking about money. So we're not going to know. We have to speculate. The most convincing speculating I've ever seen is done by the most famous coin collector in the world, beyond collecting, studied coins, was a guy named Philip Grierson at University of Cambridge in England. When he died, he donated all the coins, which were worth a fortune, to the University of Cambridge. He speculated that actually money came out of the ancient tribal practice that's called Wehrgeld. Now that was applied to the Germans. Roman society was civilized. Germany was still a tribal society. The Romans studied the German tribal society, so we know a lot about how it functioned. But anthropologists find that every tribal society they come across also has this Wehrgeld tradition. If you cause an injury to someone else, okay, here, whoops, killed the guy, a fine is imposed on you. And you have to pay a fine to the victim's family. Okay? These fines were in kind. It would depend on what the injury was. That would determine what you had to pay, whether it's a goat or a cow or a horse or sheep or chicken. Oh, as far back as there was tribal society and humans came out of tribal society, so it's as old as humans. Okay, when did they come up with the idea and why did they come up with it? We don't know when, but it's obvious why they did it. To stop blood feuds. Otherwise, you have the Hatfields and the McCoys killing each other. So this is to stop retribution. You had to pay a fine. So Grierson's notion was that the concept of valuing things came out of the Wehrgeld tradition. It was a huge jump because Wehrgeld, you pay a cow versus a chicken, depending on the damages you had done. Money allows you to compare those things. Oh, it takes 100 chickens value to equal 1 cow. He thinks that's where money came from. It's a big intellectual jump, bigger than any measuring jump we had ever done before, because the measurements before money always were length. What's the length? Foot. Whose foot? The king's foot. Okay? Or cubit and so on. Those are relatively easy. Now, a hint is that every ancient money unit was the name of a grain weight unit. Shekel, lira, pound, those are all weight units. They all came out of measuring grain. So someone had the idea, let's use the grain measurement in order to measure the value of everything. By Babylonian times, this is exactly what they did, and then the price list, the equivalents to the mina, which was a grain weight unit, was posted at the temple. That is how you knew the value of everything. It was set by the temple's authorities. I'll come back to religion because it's important for money. Okay, alternative, what is money?
Would you define money?
I will. It is a state monopoly. It is a social unit of measurement. If you're in America, you can point to anything, you can ask people, what is that worth? They're not going to tell you in terms of chickens. They're going to tell you in terms of dollars. Almost everything can be valued in terms of dollars. Now, not quite everything, but as capitalism develops, a greater and greater range of things are measured in terms of money. It is a state money of account. Almost without exception, the money unit of account that we use comes from the state. Every time a new country is formed, it chooses its own money of account. Why did we get the dollar in the US? Because we didn't want the pound. Okay? We just revolted. We chose the dollar, and we modeled our currency after the Spanish currency to thumb our noses at England. Right? And then we have money records. There's a hierarchy of these IOUs denominated in the state money of account. There is bank money, okay, and there are your IOUs. They're all denominated in the US dollar in America. The form that they take depends on technology. I'll come back to this. Paper money, coin money, electronic money, that is just the technological way of recording. The tally sticks, it might seem like that's a pretty primitive technology, but actually the tally sticks were a very advanced technology. It was hard to counterfeit. The problem with early coins and early paper money was counterfeiting wasn't all that hard to do. Counterfeiting was a tremendous problem when paper money started to be used. Okay? A lot of the technological advance is to reduce counterfeiting. What backs up our money today? When I first started teaching, the majority of the students in the class would say gold. Now this was in the early 80s. Okay? We had gone off gold under Richard Nixon. So it was already a decade that we had completely abandoned gold. It wasn't true then. Today, students rarely raise their hand because they all listen to Ron Paul, who wants to go back to gold, and they know that we're not on gold. Okay, so now it's very obvious. So I like to take the notes out and read what it says on the note. Okay, and probably you've all seen this on dollar bills. It says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Canadian dollar, Australian dollar. Okay? They all say virtually the same thing, so a lot of people say, oh, it's legal tender laws. But you know that that's false. Okay? When it says it's legal tender for all debts, public and private, many times your cash is refused. They say, no, we don't take cash. Right? So it's just not true. And there are plenty of currencies that never had legal tender laws. What does the British pound say? Well, they don't have pound notes, so you have to look at a 5 pound. This is a picture of the Queen, and this is what she's telling you. I promise to pay the bearer on demand the sum of 5 pounds. What does that mean? You take a 5 pound note to the Queen, she will give you a 5 pound note. That's what it means. It's 5 pounds. Okay? That's all it says. The older people will remember who this is. Okay. Alternative. The use of the currency and value of money are based on the power of the issuing authority, not on the intrinsic value. Okay? The currency does not have to have any intrinsic value. It's based on the power of the issuing authority. The currency itself is a record of debts, whether it's printed on paper or stamped on a coin. It's a record of a debt. It is a promise to redeem, and I'll say more about what redemption means. The state played the central role in the evolution of money from the very beginning. It always has played the central role. What we typically find when we look around the world today and we look back as far back as we can go, about 5,000 to 6,000 years into the past, what we find is the one state or one nation, one currency rule. Each nation or state has its own currency. When the Soviet Union falls apart, every one of the former members chooses its own currency. Okay? In the past, the exceptions to this rule were extremely small and virtually irrelevant. The Vatican State used the Italian lira. Okay? That was an exception, minor. The only major exception to this rule is Euroland. It was an experiment in an exception, and it's been disastrous. Okay? Before the euro, this is what we find. It's not a coincidence. It's tied up with sovereign power, political independence, and fiscal authority. This is why every new nation adopts its own currency. And finally, taxes drive money. Taxes are what gives value its money. It is the power to impose taxes that is the important sovereign power that ensures the currency has value. I'll say more about this too. Okay, you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the written records at the time. Okay, let's look at the colony of Virginia. The colonies were not allowed to coin. The colonies had to use the crown's coins. Okay, the colonies were always short of money in order to hire the armies to fight the Indians and the French Canadians. So they started issuing paper monies, okay? Paper money was created and directly spent by the legislature. Every paper money included a new tax. Okay. So when they passed a law to authorize printing 10,000 pounds, Virginia pounds, they also imposed a tax that they expected would raise 10,000 pounds. They imposed the tax the same time that they issued the notes. Now, why would they impose a tax? Because it created a demand for those notes. The colonial regular people had severe shortage of coins too. They couldn't have paid the new tax with the coins. There's not enough. Now, they were allowed to pay taxes with coins. Of course, the Virginia colonial government was glad to have the coins, okay? But they typically paid most of the tax in the form of notes. When the colonial legislature received the tax revenue, what did they do with it? They burned it. They did not spend their tax revenue. They burned it. So as the notes come in, they burn them. What did the King of England do when the tally sticks came in tax payments? Burned them. You always burn your tax revenue. You do not spend tax revenue, you burn it. In fact, they finally outlawed the use of tally sticks in England in around 1840. All the tally sticks were brought in, and the people at the Exchequer, which is the Treasury, the IRS, they were so glad they didn't have to use tally sticks anymore, matching them. They threw them all into the stoves at the same time. They burned down Parliament. There's a very famous painting of Parliament burning down. It's because they burned the tally sticks. Okay, anyway. So anyway, the revenues received were burned. The notes that were not received remained out and were used in the markets and actually were preferred over the coins. People preferred to use the notes rather than the coins. Okay, the taxes were paid in notes or specie. About 3/4 of the taxes were paid with notes and 1/4 were paid with the coins. This tax that was imposed by the legislature when they issued the notes was called a redemption tax. It was called a redemption tax. Okay, that's written right into the law. They knew what they were doing. The purpose of the tax is to redeem the notes. It gives a demand for the notes, and then the notes are brought back and burned. That prevents them from causing inflation. The purpose of the tax was to get most of the notes out so there wouldn't be any inflation. Adam Smith, 1776, wrote about this. He said, you know, there's this strange thing going on in the colonies. They're issuing paper money, but it retains its value as long as they don't issue too much of it. Okay? So you use the taxes to make sure they don't stay out there and cause inflation. Another example. This one's a little bit different. Okay? This is the Yap Islands. And economists use this as an example all the time of primitive people using money that is a commodity. So they decided to use these stone wheels as money to reduce the transactions costs of barter. Nobody's laughing. Here's how tall they are. Here's their coin. Okay? When you want to go to the market to buy a fat pig, you have to get 10 strong guys. You put a log through here, you pick it up, and you carry it to the market, and you buy a pig. That reduced the transactions costs. Okay? It turns out on the Yap Islands, they don't have any stones like this. They have to get their dugout canoes, they paddle across open ocean 200 miles to go get the stone. They carve it, they put it on the canoe, and they try to paddle back. And a lot of the stones, the canoe flips over, and they end up on the bottom of the ocean. But when the Yap Islanders consider their wealth of stones, they include all the ones that fell on the bottom, because it doesn't matter. They know they still have them. I mean, they don't have them on the island, but they know where they are, more or less. They can't get them, but it doesn't matter. Okay? So anyway, economists wrote this up as, this is primitive money. Okay? They don't tell you the second part of the story. So the Germans are trying to colonize the Yap Islands. The Germans want some roads built. So they go to the island, you know, and they say, hey, we need the road built. We'll pay you currency to build the road. And I don't know what the German currency then was, but let's say it's the mark. You know, we'll pay you 5 marks an hour to build the road. The Yap Islanders look at them like they're crazy. Say, you want me to work for pieces of paper? And of course, the Germans look at them like they're crazy. You guys are so lazy, you won't even work for money. Okay? So they wouldn't work for the German currency. So some bright colonial governor said, I know what we'll do. Go through with a can of black paint and paint a big X on about half of the stones. So that's what they did. So they go through, they paint a black X. And the islanders say, what's going on? I say, well, we tax those. Okay, those are ours now. And they say, how can we get them back? I say, well, you can build a road. So they reversed the sequence, but the tax turned these into money. They were not money before. They were what we call primitive valuables. All tribal society has primitive valuables. They're usually things that are completely useless, and that's on purpose. And then they attach great ceremonial value to them. Okay? So this is a typical tribal thing that Europeans could not conceive of, so they thought they must be money. But they were turned into money only by a tax that the colonial government put on them. Okay, again, you don't have to believe me. Here is Beardsley Ruml. I'm not going to read the whole quote. Beardsley Ruml was an extremely important person. He was the chairman of the New York Fed. The New York Fed used to be called chairman, not president. Okay, that was to indicate how he was more important than the chairman of the Fed. Okay, still is, but we pretend like it's Janet Yellen. Okay, so anyway, he writes an article at the end of the war, and the title of the article is Taxes for Revenue is Obsolete. We do not need taxes for revenue. We need them for other purposes. We need them to fight inflation. We need them to change people's behavior, so we tax cigarettes and so on. We don't need them for revenue purposes. He says, that is what the war taught us and the people. Okay, how did it teach us that? We were running budget deficits of 25% of GDP with no negative impacts on the economy at all. Okay? Here's an exchange between the head of the Fed, so this one is the chairman of the Fed, and Wright Packman, who was an important representative. During the war, the Fed bought lots of government bonds to keep the interest rate near zero. Okay? And so here's Packman. How did the government, how did you, the Fed, get the money to buy those $2 billion of government securities? $2 billion sounds like little now, but it was a lot back then. We created it. Out of what? Out of the right to issue money credit. And there's nothing behind it except the government's credit? Well, we have the government bonds. That's right, that's government's credit. In other words, the only thing you have is another government debt. Okay? So we've created money that is a government debt, and all that stands behind it is another government debt. So they go on. Packman, do you believe that people should pay their debts generally when they can? I think it depends a good deal upon the individual, but of course, if there were no debt in our money system, there wouldn't be any money. Whoops, sorry, I forgot to show you. There wouldn't be any money. Mr. Packman, suppose everybody paid their debts. Would we have any money to do business on? Okay, and of course the answer is no. If everybody repaid their debt, there would be no money. Mr. Eccles says, he sees what direction he's going. He says, that's correct. In other words, our system is based entirely on debt. Okay, yes, it is. Or finally, here's Bernanke. The Fed lent and spent about $34 trillion to save Wall Street. $34 trillion. So he's interviewed on 60 Minutes. Is that tax money the Fed is spending? You notice it's virtually identical to what was asked at the end of World War II. It's not tax money. We simply use the computer to mark up the size of the account. If they have somebody at the Fed who has a finger, that is how they do it. Keystrokes. It's just keystrokes. That's how you do it. Okay. How are we doing? I think I'm going to skip over some history of thought here. Implications. Fiat money is not worthless. It's valuable due to the state's promise to redeem it in payments to the state. You can find this in the economic literature. The very best place to start is with A. Mitchell Innes, who was the Queen's ambassador to Washington. He was an autodidactic. He wrote something on beekeeping, and then he wrote the 2 best articles ever written on money. Okay. How he figured it out, I have no idea. Keynes reviewed it and said, we might quibble with some of the details, but the argument is sound. Okay. Money and debt are linked. Debts are denominated in the state money of account. My professor Minsky used to always say, anybody can create money, the problem is to get it accepted. Creating money is a matter of writing, I owe you $5. Your problem is to get somebody to accept that. Now, banks have an easy time, you have a harder time. All monies are created as liabilities of the issuers, and here's the key point that Innes makes. All issuers must accept their own liabilities back in payment. If you refuse to accept it, you have defaulted. Why was the Bank of England created? The king defaulted on his tally sticks. One of the King Georges, I don't remember which number. He defaulted on his tally sticks. So they had to create the Bank of England because nobody trusted that king anymore. Okay, he refused to accept back his own tally sticks in payment. All money is credit money. The state money approach might appear to be inconsistent with the credit money approach, but even state money is credit money. The state's money is the government's debt, the government's IOU, and they must accept it back in payment. Redemption then means delivering an IOU in payment to its issuer. All right? It doesn't matter whether the IOU is printed on a gold coin or printed on paper. It's an IOU. Okay? It doesn't need to have any intrinsic value or not, but even if it does, it is still an IOU. So sovereignty is a set of institutions. There are many other aspects of sovereignty, but the important one for money is that the sovereign has the power to impose fees, fines, taxes, and to name what it will accept in payment of those obligations to the state. When the fees, fines, and taxes are paid, the currency is redeemed. It's accepted back by the sovereign issuer. Some sovereigns also agree to redeem their IOUs for gold when you're on a gold standard, but that's not necessary. Now, we know it's not necessary, okay, because we gave it up a long time ago. Skip the rest of that. So, in almost all religions, debt is a sin, but being a creditor is an equal sin. Okay? So you're sinful on either side of the equation. The debts are paid by delivering back an IOU to the issuers. That is what we call redemption. These terms, of course, came from religion because money came out of the temples. So it's not a coincidence that many of the terms we use when we talk about money are terms we use when we talk about religion. So you can read this slide on your own. Which comes first, creation or redemption? Okay. You've got to create first before you can redeem. If you aren't in debt, you can't redeem yourself. Redemption can't come first. Debt has to come first. Government has to spend first, which is getting the government itself in debt, before the government can redeem itself, collect back in taxes. The colonial governments had to spend the notes before they can collect them. They have to be in sinful debt before they can be redeemed. This is true for everybody. Government, bank, household. You can't redeem your debts until you have created the debts. So how does a government really spend? Okay? Things are more complicated than they used to be. Our government does not spend paper money into existence. The paper money is issued only because you go to an ATM machine and make withdrawals. Our government doesn't spend the way that governments always had spent in the past. Why? Because there are two things in between you and the government. One is your bank, and the other is the government's bank, which we call the central bank. Okay? So you are, 3 degrees of separation away from the government. The government imposes a tax on you, but you pay taxes by writing a check or an electronic deduction from your bank account. The central bank deducts your bank's reserves and credits the Treasury's account at the central bank. When the Treasury wants to spend, it cuts a check. Okay? When you deposit it in your bank credits your account, sends the check on to the Fed credits your bank's reserves, and then debits the Treasury's account at the central bank. Okay? So it's more complicated, and it's more complicated than that, because we have a whole bunch of what are called tax and loan accounts and special depositories and so on and so on and so on that complicates the procedures and makes it a lot harder to see how things actually work. But the logic remains, it's still the same. You can't deduct reserves from banks unless they have them. They can only get them from the government. So the government either has to spend or lend the reserves before the banks can have their reserves debited when you make your tax payments. All the logic remains. One of the first things that MMT did was to get into the details of how everything operates today, which I can tell you no economist knew. None. Before we looked into it. Now, of course, there were people at the Treasury and the Fed who knew because they had to do it. Okay, but academic economists had no idea how the government really spends. So some of our earliest articles 20 years ago were, How does the government really spend? So we have gone through all the details, and we've done it for other countries too. And it's the same. Okay, I mean, minor detail changes, but otherwise it's the same. Policy implications. Government cannot go bankrupt in its own currency. It can issue more through keystrokes. It can make all payments on government bonds through keystrokes. Okay? You don't take that money away from taxpayers, as Bernanke explained. How did they spend and lend $34 trillion to save Wall Street? It was all keystrokes. There is no limit. The government can always afford to buy anything for sale. If there are unemployed people around, the government can always afford to get them jobs and pay their wages. The only economic constraints government faces are full employment of resources. Once you've employed all of them, okay, except for imports, the resources are already all used. And any further spending will be inflationary. Okay? So full employment and then an inflation constraint. Other constraints are political. So, during the global financial crisis, Obama comes in, okay, and things are getting worse and worse and worse and worse. And Obama wanted to spend more. Okay? We finally got a fiscal stimulus package of $800 billion, which was $400 billion spread over 2 years. Okay, $400 billion and then $400 billion. Any economist who studied the economy, other than extremely ideological ones, knew that wasn't enough. Obama knew it wasn't enough. So he goes on TV and what does he say? We're out of money. We would like to do more, but we ran out. Okay? We're on an unsustainable debt path. Okay, this is what many economists were claiming. We got to borrow from the Chinese. We ran out of money, so we got to get the dollars from Beijing, which is ridiculous if you think about it. All dollars came from the United States. Okay. We'll become Weimar or Zimbabwe, hyperinflation. Look at Euroland, that could happen to us. We'll be just like the next Greece. Okay. Burden our grandkids, all this stuff. All of this is false. It's absolutely false. Okay? None of this could possibly happen. Paul Samuelson, who was the most important textbook writer for your grandparents, was interviewed in 1974. It's a very interesting interview. You can find it on the web, interviewed by Mark Blaug. He says, I think there's an element of truth in the superstition that the budget must be balanced. Here he said at all times, but later in the interview, he's talking about balancing the budget over the cycle. And he says, it's like the old-fashioned religion was to scare people by sometimes what might be regarded as myths. So the purpose of these kinds of statements is to scare you. That is the purpose. It's not true. It's a superstition. It's like old-time religion. We know it's not true. But economists, are in the business of dishonesty. Because we got to scare you. Okay? This is Paul Samuelson, who's the greatest, according to many, greatest economist. Here's the St. Louis Fed. The St. Louis Fed is the second most conservative Fed in the United States. It's the home of Milton Friedman's monetarism. Here's the St. Louis Fed. I won't read it all. You can read the quote. And what they say is the government can never run out of dollars. It can never be forced to default. It can never be forced to miss a payment. It is actually never subject to the whims of bond vigilantes. All of that is false. This is the St. Louis Fed. Greenspan said the same thing. When he was asked, will Social Security really go broke? He said, no, of course not. The government has this thing called a printing press. Okay, we don't use a printing press. He should have said, we have this thing called the computer. And it has keys on it. We can't run out. King of France. I'm afraid I'm going to have to skip the sectoral balancing, which is very interesting, but let me conclude. So there are two views on the origins, the origins of money story that you adopt tells you what you think the nature of money is. Okay? Do the Orthodox economists really believe Robinson Crusoe's story? Probably not. They tell that story because it focuses your attention on what they want you to focus your attention on. The idea of markets and money as a medium of exchange, okay? The alternative to that is a social relations story, variegated debt, role of the authorities, choosing a money of account, the state money, the currency, and taxes drive money. Again, the story of the origins, we don't know this, the truth, okay? But variegated focuses your attention on debt, okay? It's in the nature of money that it must be debt. There's a movement now called debt-free money. It's a non sequitur. It's impossible. Money is debt. Bitcoins are not money. Can't be money. Money is not primarily a medium of exchange. Money is a state monopoly, unit of account, driven by obligations to the state. Typically now it's taxes. Banks make payments for their customers in bank IOUs that are denominated in the state's money. Deficit spending creates financial wealth. That's the part I didn't get to do, the sectoral balance approach. And a sovereign cannot run out of its own IOUs. So I'll stop there and hope we have time for questions. Money is a debt denominated in the money of account. And it's almost always a state money of account. Even the few possible exceptions to that, it is still a socially determined money of account. Now you could choose your own money of account. You say, my money of account is, I don't know, Glocks. Well, the problem for you is you got to get other people to accept it, right? Having your own idiosyncratic measure of value is not going to be accepted. So it comes from the authorities, and since the development of nation states, it always comes from the nation state. Even if you are a country, say Ecuador, that adopts the US dollar, you're still choosing a national money of account. You've just chosen to give sovereignty to the US rather than to your own country. Once you reach full employment, if you continue to increase government spending, you're going to be trying to bid resources away that are already employed. And if the private sector can match you, then you get into a bidding war. And you will drive up prices. You can cause inflation. In fact, and you will cause inflation if you reach full employment and you continue trying to increase spending. You can get inflation before full employment, which is something the Keynesians didn't realize in the 60s, depending on what you're spending on. Okay, so whether there's 6-8% unemployment out there, but if what you're doing is picking off, say, the high-trained engineers and so on, you can cause inflation long before you get those 6 to 8% employed because they don't have the skills the government is hiring. So you can get inflation even before full employment, okay? So we admit that. I mean, and we warn about it, that's what Beardsley Rummel was saying, okay? Taxes are to fight inflation. So if you're going to continue to increase government spending, you also need to raise taxes. Because what the taxes will do is reduce the private sector's ability to compete with you. So what do you do in wartime? You raise taxes, you try patriotic saving, you put rationing on. All of those are to prevent inflation. We know how to do it. Now there are no cases, zero, of modern developed capitalist countries using their own currency who get hyperinflation. Zero. Hyperinflation is extremely rare phenomenon, and you can list the 3 of them, okay, that have happened that everybody knows about. So everyone is worrying about something that is extremely rare, and when you look at the causes of the hyperinflations, it had nothing to do with government deficits. What was Germany's problem? War reparations and the seizure by France of most of their industrial sector. So they had to make reparations. They were not able, they would have had to export almost all of their output in order to get the pounds and gold they needed to make the payments. Okay? So
they printed money to do it.
They did print money. But they already had these conditions put on them. Okay, so now the government, of course, is worried about the population, and the government needs to make the payments. So a deficit resulted because of this. If you look at the deficits, what the government is trying to do is to keep up with the rate of price increase. Because when you have high inflation, your tax revenue will never keep up, because taxes are always calculated after the fact. And if prices can go up by 100% per day, and your taxes are collected maybe every quarter, by the time you're collecting taxes, it's on income that is in a currency that was 10 times more valuable than it is today. So a deficit will result in those conditions. When you look at Zimbabwe, what you find that this was a result of a collapse of their agriculture, because they had possibly very good intentions of land reform. They put the land into the hands of people who could not produce as much output. So it was a collapse of supply. In both of those cases, really, it's a collapse of supply, because the production had to go to pay war reparations. Keynes wrote about this right at the end of World War I. He said, if the Allies put these payments on Germany, okay, they can't possibly make those payments. And his first famous book, and he was absolutely right. So it was predictable, and it was foreseen what was going to happen. Okay, so the hyperinflations are evidence of other problems. They are not evidence of budget deficits. Budget deficits will occur just because everything the government is buying is going to be going up in price at the rate of inflation, and their tax revenue lags way behind. So in the United States and every country I know of, we have a budgeting process. What does the budget do? It puts limits on the spending. Now, some kinds of spending are a bit more open-ended, because if it's unemployment compensation, you can't predict exactly how many people are going to be unemployed, and in a downturn, that spending will go up. But it is limited because the people have to qualify, right? Something like 1/3 of American workers will qualify for unemployment compensation if they lose their jobs through no fault of their own. And so it's limited by that. There's always a limit, okay? In addition to that, the US alone has an absolutely crazy limit. It's called the debt limit. We're the only country that does this, okay? That one, in the past, never proved to be a limit because Congress always raised the limit. Every time, routinely, they would just raise the limit. But then the Republicans decided they could get a lot of political capital out of postponing the approval. So they could make, even though you've already budgeted all the social programs and they agreed to the budget, they think they get a second chance to get rid of some social programs that they don't like. So they always try to do this. So it became a political issue. But yes, you need limits, okay? And if you're moving into a situation where the government is going to need a lot more resources, so typical, it's war. But it wouldn't have to be war. Let's say that Trump was serious when he proposed infrastructure, okay? Well, now, if the government is going, and we need about $3 trillion just so we have safe infrastructure. To catch up and keep pace with the Chinese, it's probably more like $5 or $6 trillion. Now, if we were to go out in a campaign to do what China is doing, we're going to be bidding away, the whole construction sector of the economy in order to try to catch up to China. That's going to be very inflationary. So we would have to put rationing on the private sector. Say, sorry, no more Trump Towers because we're going to do infrastructure now. So you would have to ration it. All right? But the fact is that outside of World War II, the U.S. has never been close to capacity. Never. We have never had a problem of excessive demand. We've never even had a problem in the labor markets. In Europe, possibly, they achieved full employment and did get inflation because the labor markets were too tight. U.S., we've never had that. We've always had plenty of unemployed people, okay? So what you had to do was target your spending. Because if you spend all of it on aerospace and military, you'll cause inflation long before you run out of resources. You just run out of the kind of resources you're buying. We always could have spent more government money, but we needed to target it at the unemployed, not targeting at the most unionized workers with the highest skills and the highest pay, which is what we always did. So everything I said about modern money theory applies to every country in the world that issues its own currency and doesn't peg its exchange rate. Everything I just said applies to them too. Virtually every country in the world has a big government debt. Ours is not big relative to many other countries in the world. Okay, Japan's was 3 times bigger. Ours is growing maybe 2.5 times bigger than ours relative to the size of the economy. Ours is not big. Americans have this conception we have a big government debt, but it's not true. It's because the media and Republicans harp on this all the time, but it's just not true. Okay, so why don't we do more? I think is the right question. All of us should do more. The countries that don't have big government debts and budget deficits are exporting countries. Exporters can get away without government deficits. The reason is because they get their demand from other countries. So China, their central government can run a balanced budget. Okay, Singapore can run a budget surplus because their demand comes from abroad. Okay, and that keeps their economy growing even though their government is actually draining the economy. So that is the only exception. If you are a current account surplus country, you don't need a budget deficit. But all other countries have them. We actually were going to subtitle ours, we're not doing it, a government-centered approach. Because every other textbook, the government comes in chapter 10, right? And you say, that's pretty bizarre because the government is by far the biggest entity in the economy. By far, nothing comes close to the size of the government, okay? And the government is the issuer of the currency. And you wait till chapter 10 to tell the students, oh, by the way, there's this thing called government too. Okay, that is very bizarre. Of course you should start with the government. It's got to be there in chapter 1. It's the most important thing about our economy. Okay? And although everyone said, well, but now we're a free market capitalist economy. The governments of capitalist economies tend to be much bigger than the governments of pre-capitalist economies. Okay? Capitalist economies need big governments. It tends to be true that as you go down, when you rank countries by size of government, as you go down, when you get to the ones with governments smaller than ours, they do not work well. So Mexico has a government that's about 13% of the economy. Is Mexico a more successful economy than the United States, which has a federal government about 20 to 25% of the economy? Okay? Almost twice as big. No. France has a government that's 50% of the economy. France used to work pretty well before they gave up their currency. So anyway, the governments of capitalist economies are big, and there's a reason for it. The medieval European governments were tiny, tiny little things. Okay? Now there are exceptions. Rome had a big government. Okay. I don't really have an opinion on that. You see very well performing economies, say the United States, until about the mid-70s, performed very well. And it was the biggest economy in the world, and it performed very well. The Chinese economy now is probably the biggest in the world. And by many measures, it performs like the world has never seen before. The world has never seen anything like China before. Okay. Now there have been other miracle economies. The Italian economy in the 60s grew at 7% per year. Okay. But China started from very, very poor, okay, underdeveloped economy. I don't know how many of you have been there. It is absolutely amazing what you see. That's why I said we need $6 trillion of infrastructure. We're going to be left so far behind. So I don't know. Small economies, some small economies also do very well. So I'm not sure that it's an economic issue. It might be a political issue. It might be that you can get more cohesive politics when you have small economies, nations. Maybe it's not an economic factor, it's a political factor. Most are not there anymore. Not anymore. 10 years ago, yeah. No, but they are developed further and further west. You land in a city, I'm not talking about the far west, but well away from the east. And the city's a few years old, and it's 8 million people, and you've never heard of it. And they've got subways. And they've got, when you fly in, it makes Manhattan look tiny, tiny, tiny with tiny little buildings compared to what they will have out in the middle of nowhere in China. They are transitioning. So I think they have about 40% are rural, and they tend to be older. And China has decided that they can provide much better services to the elderly if they get them out of the rural areas. And so there is a transition process, and they have not figured this out yet. I know. My wife is Chinese. I go to China all the time. I see the problems you're talking about. China has big problems, and they're trying to solve them. I was focusing on how quickly they have developed from, horse carts to now you go to a train station, and they have 25 bullet trains sitting there ready to go. Everyone is full always. Always. In fact, more than full. And they're going 300 kilometers an hour. The train stations, the airports, you've seen nothing like this. If you've ever used JFK, and then you go to Beijing, which has 3 airports, you will be absolutely amazed. And yes, who is flying in China? Well, it's a lot like the way the United States was 20 years ago. Yeah, you're talking about people with more money and educated. You go to the center of cities, and everybody's driving cars that are $100,000 because they cost twice as much there. But they're all luxury cars. Inflation in the U.S. is under 2%. Now, for seniors, let me finish. For seniors, inflation is higher than that. Okay, Social Security, the COLAs are not taking account of the prices seniors pay, and they need to adjust that. And the lower income, so Social Security is based on your income over your working life. At the lower income levels, the Social Security that you will get at retirement is not nearly sufficient. Okay, those are problems. Can we solve those? Of course we can. Is it affordable? Of course it is. So what I am telling you actually gives you the solution. If you take the Orthodox approach, there really is no solution because they believe we're very constrained. We have to take more from working age people and young folks to take care of the retirees. They have created this whole story of intergenerational warfare. They're trying to turn young people against Social Security, saying, you guys will never get it as good as old people now. Social Security is going broke. We would have to raise your taxes to 25%, just the payroll part, in order to take care of seniors. It's all false. Completely false. We don't have to do any of that. The only thing that really matters is our productive capacity. If that grows, young people today will have a better retirement than people are now. Okay, as long as our productive capacity continues to grow. If it grows at a normal pace, their standard of living should be between 2 and 4 times greater than retirees today, without any changes to Social Security, just making the commitments we already promised to them. All right? But we got people running around trying to tell all the young people that Social Security is a bad deal, we need to get rid of it, they should have their own private retirement plans. Okay, so they can lose all their money in the stock market and end up living in poverty in their old age. Okay, that's the mainstream story. My story is completely different. Affordability is not the issue. Okay, productive capacity is the issue. And by not spending now, we will not have the productive capacity in the future. If we continue to just let everything deteriorate, we won't be able to take care of seniors in the future. I think Martin needs to talk.